So, Chapter 3 deals with children at risk for disability. We're really going to focus on objectives number 1 and 2, defining risk, and studying those select groups that are more susceptible to risk of disability, and what are some benefits of studying risk, as well are the challenges related to risk. So why do we study risk? Primarily for 2 reasons. One is screening, so that if a child is at risk, we can screen for disability, so that we can catch a potential problem. And we know the second reason, that the sooner we can identify whether or not the child is at risk, the sooner we can have the child access services. There are many benefits. Certainly, if we notice any symptoms or behaviors, we can provide services as early intervention. And we know for some children, starting at birth, they're at risk for developmental delay or disability, or they might have a disability at birth, and so they're at risk for some future challenges, and we want to make sure we get services in as soon as possible. And really, a benefit that stems from the law is that there is mandate that school districts identify children. That's our child find identification. And so it is mandated that we identify risk. And we know that the benefits are that in the screening process, we're doing formal screening. Besides the vision and hearing and medical, we're also doing developmental scales and checklists. We're observing the child in the child's natural environments. We're also just doing some developmental history, looking at records and looking at, has there been any intervention done in the past? So the screening process takes many forms, and that is the benefit of trying to, really identify risk, in that we're looking at a child's complete educational history, attendance history, if they've been in a school or daycare setting. We're conferencing with parents and getting a sense of the home environment and the developmental environment for the child, as well as looking at the child and child conferencing if possible. So again, early screening here, so that there's a wide range of services and agencies we can refer parents to. And certainly in some areas it's easier to get services than other areas, but all children are entitled to services, and so we're looking to provide services. And we are looking at the response to intervention model, multi-tier system of supports for children once we know that they are at risk for academic and our social and emotional and behavior delays. So what is the definition of risk? Well, it's those characteristics that, when present in a typically developing child, increase the likelihood for a disability. So we're not really talking about children who are born with disability that right away would receive services, but those particular children that are potentially at risk. And we do look at the family as a whole, because families are not single units working within the means of their own environments. There's many factors that factor into risk. So it's not just a family unit in terms of what's happening presently in the family, but there are many, many factors that we consider, though, within the family environment and the family unit that may increase the likelihood for disability. So what are the categories of risk? Well, there's environmental categories, biological, substance abuse, genetics, sociological variables such as poverty, English not being the main language in the home, as well as students that are marginalized. Environmental, we're looking at such things as children that live around toxins, access to quality health care. There are plenty of populations where access to convenient, affordable health care is not there for them. Children living in poverty, children living in violence, crimes. These are all impacting children's physical and mental health. as well as the family's health. And we know that when there's stress within the family, that will impact the child. Biological, there's a number of biological factors that can impact a child for being at risk for disability. We know that males are more vulnerable to prenatal problems, low birth weight, in vitro drug exposure, and any genetic abnormalities. Substance abuse also places a child at risk, particularly when the child is in utero, and such things as parents, particularly the mother smoking, may cause low birth weight, difficulties in motor activity for the child, cognitive impairment, and problems during the birthing process as well. Additionally, we know that for mothers who consume alcohol, children may end up with fetal alcohol syndrome, which definitely is a very challenging disability for the child and the family. We know that there are characteristics that we can actually visually see children who have had fetal alcohol syndrome, such as a smaller head size, larger ears, shorter than average height, low body weight, poor memory, hyperactivity, learning disabilities, and particular problems with things that really involve perseverance and problem solving. Also, there's a lot of behavior problems that can result for the child in terms of fetal alcohol syndrome. Additionally, any types of exposure to drugs will impact the child's development. So 17% of children reported symptoms of oppositional defiant disorder. Again, that's the behavior issues as the result of substance abuse, as well as clinical elevated levels of ADHD. And this is a table in your textbook. I would take a look at that, and that's just prenatal drug exposure and the potential effects. Genetics. Parents' genetic histories are important. We do have generations of families with disability in the family, so it's important to know the history. And any of the 13 disability categories that are part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act can be caused by genetic disorders. And these involve, of course, recessive gene and dominant genes in parents in terms of resulting in disability. Again, so we're looking at really medical history, parents really understanding the genetics, working with the medical community. So what is the diagnosis then, potential diagnosis, care, and prevention for the child. Children living in poverty, this is obviously something that unfortunately in our society keeps growing. It's also the most pervasive, it's large, and it involves far too many children, and it was one of the biggest impacts of risk for children being unprepared for school, but also unprepared in life and at risk for disability. So there are 7 significant risk factors in families living in poverty. A lot of times they're households with families where there's limited English speakers. A lot of times they're very large families, so resources may be at a minimum. Low parental education. Residential mobility, these are people who maybe cannot pay rent, cannot stay long. Homelessness becomes a factor. Single parent households, and the largest risk factor is single parent households and teen mothers. Non-employed parents, and 3% of children in poverty are impacted by 3 or more of these risk factors. And again, this is just a figure from your textbook, so it gives you a sense of children entering school. What do they come knowing in terms of their vocabulary? And there's been a lot of studies in this area, so early intervention will be critical. Our English language learners, we know that in the home, English may not be the main language. Many are first-generation participants in public schools, so they may not understand our school system and may be suspect in terms of our school system. And sometimes it's hard to separate out the language barrier versus disability. So it's really important to pay attention to these children and try to figure out what's going on. We do know that then as a result of this, particularly some groups are over-identified and some are under-identified, and therefore, again, as I stated, special education decisions may be very challenging. And who are our students experiencing marginalization? And these are students who are looked at as different, maybe on the outskirts of the norm of society. A lot of times we're talking about African American males are really over-identified for disability, and our students who are not identified as heterosexual, are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender students are marginalized students, and so they are at risk as well. So marginalized youth can be children that are facing a lot of challenges. They may be facing challenges in the home as well as in the community. And so we have to be very, very in tune to that. A lot of these children are bullied, particularly in the LGBTQA population. So we need to be very much aware of that risk. So student-related, in terms of outcomes, sometimes we see general low abilities then, early pregnancy, substance abuse, negative relationships, and low self-esteem, self-efficacy. And school-related, sometimes there is conflict then between the home and the school. There's ineffective discipline both in the home and the school, negative climates, and poor resources. And this is from your text as well, Table 3.2. And this is looking at particular ethnic groups and their reading and math progress from a certain year. And finally, the last group we're going to talk about is gifted children. Many of us don't view gifted children as being marginalized, but they certainly can be. Partly the reason is they socially may be so different from their peers. They may not be getting the education they need in the classroom. They possess specialized skills, but they also need to be addressed in terms of their emotional and behavioral issues as well. We need increased screening, appropriate screening. We need to make sure that children are being educated at the appropriate level, emotionally with peers their age. We need to look at a strength-based approach when we're teaching. And many of these children are twice exceptional. So we need to be aware that just because you're gifted doesn't mean you can't have a learning disability or some other disability. So early intervention is important. It is an entitlement through Part C of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And we have to make sure we're screening. And that takes us through Chapter 3.